So this is a conversation with Daryn Howland. She's a Beirut-based researcher who recently finished her MA thesis entitled Racist Capital, the Racialization of Migrant Labor under the Kafala System in Beirut, which was the subject of our discussion. Daryn argues that the racialization and dehumanization of migrant domestic workers under the Kafala system in Lebanon contains four components: commodification, inferiorization, criminalization, and sexualization. These four components are crucial to the reproduction of the Kafala system's structural racism, which ultimately confines migrant domestic workers, the overwhelming majority of whom are women, to their labor. We unpack each of them so that, hopefully, you'll get a good sense of how the Kafala system functions on a structural level by the end of this episode. We also spoke about how the components of the Kafala system also end up affecting any person of color, particularly of African and Asian heritage, in Lebanon. So as usual, you can follow the podcast on Twitter @FireTheseTimes, and if you like what I do, please consider supporting this project with only $1 a month on Patreon on buymeacoffee.com, and you can also do so directly on PayPal if you prefer. Patreon is for monthly, PayPal is for one-offs, and Buy Me a Coffee has both options. And if you cannot donate, you can still help by reviewing this podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
My name is Daryn Howland. I'm a researcher based in Beirut. My research focuses primarily on issues of socioeconomic justice and migration, and I did my graduate dissertation on the Kafala system and racism in Lebanon, looking at how the Kafala system is implicated in kind of the practices of racism and exploitation of migrant workers here in Lebanon. Excited to discuss more about it, especially now in light of kind of how things have progressed in Lebanon.
Yeah.
I finished the research the end of last year, kind of right before the revolution hit.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously a lot of new developments have happened with, the dual shock of COVID and economic crisis that have, altered the dynamics a lot or kind of rendered them more visible.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the title of your thesis, I'll just read it out for those listening. You called it Racist Capital, the Racialization of Migrant Labor under the Kafala System in Beirut. And if it's okay with you, I'll just read the abstract. I have it in front of me, just to sort of ground our conversation. This project builds on the assumption that everyday racism targeting migrant workers in Lebanon constitutes a form of structural violence resulting from the Kafala system, and more broadly, the consolidation of global capitalism and subsequent transformations in the global labor market. This operationalization of structural violence thus looks at racism as a microcosm of larger global and economic processes, while remaining attentive to the various ways it materializes in the course of everyday life. This research is guided by questions about the interdynamics of law and society, with a specific focus on the process by which legal structures enable a process of racialization that manifests in everyday racist patterns and practices. So I'll let you, if it's okay, kind of like guide us through the main arguments made in the thesis, kind of just like to ground our conversation a bit. And if you can also like just give some background on how you came to write it, maybe some personal background, like what your personal interests might have been and so on.
I came to this formulation of the topic sort of out of personal interest. I'm American originally, so I came to Lebanon about 3.5 years ago and had never heard of the Kafala system before I came here. And so I was sort of, struck by how palpable and how visible the displays of racism were, and just like how visible that kind of racial separation was. But at the same time, I felt like I lacked the kind of theoretical framework or understanding to be able to articulate, how racism and racial construction in Lebanon works. Because obviously my understanding of racism comes from a very different historical and socioeconomic context back in the States. So I felt like I could see the racism, but I couldn't explain it. So obviously I knew it was related to the issue of the Kafala system and migrant labor, but felt like I needed to, or wanted to kind of explore more concretely the particular, processes and dynamics that create categories of race that, manifest in the racism that we see in Lebanon. And I mean, I think the Kafala system is something that has been written about and talked about increasingly within the past, decade or two. Obviously, it deserves more attention than it gets, but civil society activists and organizations writing more about the issue. I think, there's a lot of good work done, but oftentimes the research and work produced on the Kafala focuses on the kind of human rights dimension, and I mean, rightly so, looks at the kind of more visible manifestations of the abuse and violence that occurs, which of course is warranted given, the egregious conditions and violence that migrant workers are subjected to. But by focusing on the aspect of race, I sort of wanted to momentarily draw the conversation away from like the specific and individual forms of violence that occur to the kind of more superstructural and economic dimension of the system, and how the kind of the structures of power that are produced at the institutional level are implicated in the kind of daily experiences of racism and kind of social imaginaries of race in Lebanon. So by focusing on race, I felt like it was a vantage point to look more at the structural dimensions of racism and how those dynamics, these kind of like very localized manifestations of racism, draw on or kind of emanate from larger global processes and kind of hierarchies of development at the global level. The argument of my thesis is identify 4 specific processes that emanate from the state and the kind of legal and juridical structures that are set up by the state that then kind of set up this process of racialization that results in the kind of dehumanizing practices and social behaviors that we see on a daily basis and that migrant workers are subjected to. So I looked at 4 specific processes, which are commodification, inferiorization, criminalization, and sexualization, and kind of look at how each aspect of the state, whether it's the Ministry of Labor or the general security and the administrative practices that are set up, result in racial ideologies and assumptions about racial individuals that then manifest in racism.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I read most of your thesis about a couple of weeks ago. And I think one major contribution that it made, at least to my understanding, is like how it explained the difference between attitudes and like on one hand, but also like processes and structures on the other. And so, because like one major issue that I really have with a number of these NGOs in Lebanon, like without really naming any, just speaking about the general attitude, and I mentioned this in previous episodes as well, is that they often try to appeal to the Lebanese to like, just don't be racist, like, just be better human beings. And, sure, that is, that should be part of the equation, obviously. But it kind of paints it as, or at least to my mind, it sort of simplifies things in the sense that it shows the kafala system as being simply a matter of like how sponsors are sometimes too mean. And it's just a matter of tackling that cruelty in the day-to-day practices, let's say, and then that would have solved everything. But you're right about the steps of of the kafala system as a process, that there is actually an entire system at place that makes it so. And you mentioned these 4, I have them in front of me as well, so I don't forget: commodification, inferiorization, criminalization, and sexualization. So one way we can kind of structure this episode is we can sort of divide it into talking about these 4 dimensions in the hope that people listening and I'll mention here that we already did 3 different kafala related episodes, 2 on the kafala system in Lebanon. The 3rd one was more about what the Lebanese should know about Ethiopia specifically, to understand why many Ethiopian women, for example, from the rural areas choose to go to Lebanon, or are tricked to go to Lebanon, might be a better way of putting it. And what happens, of course, when they actually do get in Lebanon. So let's start with commodification. For those who don't know, what does that even mean? And how would you apply it how did you apply it in your thesis in the context of the kafala system? What should people know about it, basically?
Right. So when we talk about racialization, it's a process by which, individuals are dehumanized, simultaneously dehumanized and racialized so that their exploitation becomes kind of like morally palatable.
Mm-hmm.
And so this process of commodification is how, through the structures of the system, migrant workers that come to Lebanon are sort of treated as commodities or as the private property of their employers. And that's by virtue of the sponsorship system, where
mm-hmm.
the residency permit of the worker is tied to a specific employer in a specific, work position, so that their kind of existence in the country is bound to that notion of labor and the labor that they perform for their sponsor. And so rather than being, an employee with certain rights and entitlements, they are rendered as the private property of their employer, because with the sponsorship system, they are excluded from protections under the Lebanese labor law. We can see, like in the incident of Lebanese employers selling their domestic workers on Facebook, within, the Facebook marketplace, where you can sell like couches or used items that you want to get rid of. I think it was a few years back, employers began selling their domestic workers, posting on Facebook, writing Ethiopian made for sale, like speaks good Arabic, good hygiene, good worker. The way that the system works is basically the state delegates its authority to regulate migrant labor to private recruitment agencies. And so the practice of, or the phenomenon of migrant workers, primarily from Asian and African countries, coming to Lebanon, it began in the late 1970s, when Lebanon was in the middle of the civil war, and the regulatory state capacity was virtually non-existent. And so these private recruitment agencies kind of emerged organically to capitalize off of the importation and matching of migrant domestic workers from Asian and African countries. So this kind of market for foreign labor emerged before there were any state regulatory systems in place to monitor and regulate it. So the incentives, the financial incentives of these recruitment agencies kind of figured prominently in the way that the system was structured and how it evolved since then, as more and more migrant domestic workers migrated to Lebanon, especially after the war ended and Reconstruction began. And so what we see is kind of in line with the typical neoliberal governance structures. The state sort of abdicates its responsibility to regulate the labor of foreign workers to private recruitment agencies, who have a clear financial incentive to exploit or disregard the kind of rights and humanity of the workers that are coming in. And so within this distribution of power, where the agencies have full mandate to act on behalf of their financial incentives and then transfer that power to the employers who are their clients, workers are then rendered as sort of as commodities, as the private property of employers who are customers at private recruitment agencies and pay to have a worker imported. And so through this process of kind of deregulation and the transfer of state authority to private recruitment agencies, and kind of putting the market for foreign labor in this context of kind of free market system, then renders migrant bodies as commodities. So yeah, this is the kind of institutional structure that sets up this process of commodification.
So it's in some ways, it's the first step in the dehumanization process of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon under the Kafala system. And I mean, we can't necessarily speak of a chronology necessarily, like the commodification happens before this necessarily, but it is definitely an essential component of it, that at the end of the day, for something this inhuman to be so normalized, the dehumanization has to start at the source. So it has to start upon arrival immediately. And you do talk about, and I'll ask you if it's okay to talk about the inferiorization, which is the second component, while also, if for those who don't know, in case they haven't listened to the previous podcast, the previous Kafala episodes, for example, to just kind of give a brief overview at the same time of like the actual process. So, someone, they go, let's say a recruitment agency goes to Ethiopia, recruits certain women from rural areas, tell them you will go there. So just kind of paint a picture in a sense for those who don't really know what we're talking about. And just to kind of allow us to talk about the second component, which is the inferiorization, if that's okay.
Right. Yeah. So the kind of foreign labor industry is sort of this kind of big global enterprise where there are kind of agencies and different enterprises that have sprung up both in countries of origin, so like in Ethiopia or Sri Lanka, as well as in the countries of destination here in Lebanon or in Jordan or in the Gulf, where Kafala is also practiced.
Yeah.
And so basically rents are extracted by all these different enterprises, both in country of origin and country of destination, to facilitate the importation, I guess you could say, of foreign workers from these less developed countries into more developed countries. So, for example, a lot of the times, the women from Ethiopia who come to Lebanon come from, impoverished rural communities where they lack access to employment or education, and oftentimes, are misled about where they're going, how much money they will earn, and what their experience is going to be by these agencies that exist in Ethiopia as well as in Lebanon. It's kind of this whole network dedicated to extracting rents off of this process of labor migration. And so oftentimes the woman is makes the decision to come, not fully aware of what they are coming to and what the situation will be when they come to Lebanon.
So they arrive they are recruited by the agencies, let's say, and then they arrive to Lebanon.
Right. So then they are then matched with an employer who comes to the agency to request a domestic worker, and will give their specifications. Oftentimes they'll specify, we want this nationality or this age. At recruitment agencies, they'll have a book full of different profiles of workers, and you can select through it or flip through it like a catalog, and select the qualifications or characteristics that you're looking for. So then they arrive at the airport and are picked up by their sponsor and brought to the home, and then once they come into Lebanon, their residency permit is attached to their employer, so they're under the complete authority of the employer. They're not protected by the labor law or any sort of government regulation. They're sort of completely at the behest of the employer and the recruitment agency. So this is kind of the first process that sets up this unequal dynamic of power through which, the employer has complete authority over the worker, the migrant.
Yeah. I'll give some context on my side as well. I mean, my family in Lebanon, up until fairly recently, has also had migrant domestic workers, usually on a contract of 3 to 5 years, more or less. And I actually went to one of those, when I started writing about the Kafala system, I went to a number of these agencies. And these agencies are fairly well organized for the most part, from what I could tell anyway. They would have, as you mentioned, these catalogs. And in these catalogs, really, like the way for people to picture them is you're literally opening a brochure as if you're having this IKEA brochure, whatever, and you see the specifics, the specs essentially on, this couch or this table or this whatnot, and there would be literally the description of the migrant domestic worker, like she is 22 years old, she speaks a bit of Arabic, she speaks a bit of English, her nationality is always mentioned, of course. Sometimes I even saw some where they mentioned the weight and the height, and really, as if, as we've mentioned a few times, as if really it's part of the commodification process. And then the inferiorization process, to kind of distinguish the two of them, maybe for those, such as myself, who may confuse the two as well. You write in the thesis, and I'm quoting here, I investigate the policies and practices employed by the Ministry of Labor to differentiate racialized labor from other groups of workers. And that, like, end quote. And that's very important, because it's not just that workers are coming from abroad to work in a certain location. It's not just that they are foreigners, but their foreignness, in this case also through the process of racialization, has to actually be emphasized time and time again for the dehumanization process to actually succeed, and so to function in like on a day-to-day basis. And so how do you say it? Like, yeah, so the process of dehumanization, as you already been saying, like starts really from the source. And if someone asks you the question, because I know that you've also attempted to answer this in the thesis, like, why does it benefit the Ministry of Labor, for example, not to really oversee this entire operation? Why has it essentially abdicated its quote unquote responsibilities to these private agencies, to the point even where like these private agencies at the end operate like on a de facto level as, you know, border control? Like they are the ones who actually when it comes to these migrant domestic workers, they are the ones essentially regulating the flow of migrant domestic workers into Lebanon. So how would you explain that, well, as best as you can? I mean, there may not be one answer necessarily, but how can you explain the fact that, or let me ask it in the way you've asked it, why do you have a maid working as your secretary?
Exactly. So yeah, part of the reason that, you know, the system is so deregulated is the fact that, you know, the recruitment agencies emerged during the war before there was, you know, when the state regulatory capacity was non-existent. And
Yes.
so they kind of had the power to really, inform how the system evolved and how it was structured. And I mean, at the same time, the state sort of profits off of this, or not profits, but benefits off of this kind of tacit acceptance of, you know, letting in foreign cheap labor to come in and perform the roles that, you know, Lebanese workers, you know, do not want to fill. And so if you think about it, I mean, regulating labor is a crucial function of the state. And so how can they let these private agencies take so much control over this like critical regulatory or critical function of the state and still perform the duty that it's supposed to, which is to, I guess, protect Lebanese labor and protect Lebanese jobs. And so one of the ways it does is through this sort of classification system that regulates the different types or different classes of foreign workers that come in. So when we talk about Kafala, generally you think about migrant workers, but technically any foreign worker that comes into Lebanon, like if it's a, you know, UN worker from France, like they're technically under the Kafala system. But the Ministry of Labor has this kind of tiered classification system to categorize the visa based on the salary that the worker is going to get. So if you're, you know, let's say an AUB professor that's coming from France, you get a category 1 visa. And so there are 4 categories, and the category 3 and 4 workers are the African and Asian migrant workers that are performing labor in the secondary labor market that command, you know, minimum wage or below minimum wage, and, you know, are excluded from labor protections that Lebanese labor or kind of the foreign workers employed in the professional class are entitled to. So, and this is kind of this classification system is one of the ways that the state can issue regulations or decrees to control the activities or movement of migrant workers without making explicit mention to their race or nationality. So all category 3 and 4 workers are pretty much migrant workers from Asian and African countries, as well as Syria and Egypt. And so if, for example, when the General Security issued a decision to deport all of the children of migrant workers, and in the decision they write category 3 and 4 workers, so that they can make these kind of unjust and, you know, exploitative rulings directed at migrant workers without saying, you know, racialized workers do not benefit from these privileges. A way for them to exclude migrant workers from certain privileges and kind of confine their existence in the country to their labor without making, you know, explicit mention of their nationality. And so you mentioned the line, why do you have a maid working as your secretary?
Yeah.
So this anecdote came from an interview I had with a woman who was an Ethiopian domestic worker and had worked in Lebanon for many years and endured, unfortunately, many years of abuse at the behest of different Lebanese employers, but had, eventually managed to learn English, speak it very well, and was able to get a position working as a secretary at a foreign company here in Lebanon. Mm-hmm. And so she's a Black woman, obviously sitting at the front desk at the office. And so she recounted to me how there was one day where a guy came in to see the manager of the office. And as he was walking out with the manager, she could hear them talking, and she saw him glance back at her and then look at the manager and say, "Why do you have a maid working as your secretary?" Mm-hmm. So I think this line is incredibly powerful in that it reveals the manner in which the system operates through the aspect of race. Yeah. Because, how did he notice that she was previously a maid, or know to associate her with maid is that she's Black. And so it is, through this system of classification that confines, racialized migrant workers to certain categories of work and the secondary labor market. And then this aspect of race is what kind of serves as a disciplining function of that system, where then if a Black woman, resolves to go find a position working as a secretary, the aspect of race kind of calls into view that transgression of, the Ministry of Labor's system of classification that is meant to confine racialized labor to, these specific forms of undervalued and stigmatized labor. So yes, I think this clearly shows how race is not just kind of like a byproduct of the system, but actually is, imperative to how the system works.
Yeah, it's literally central to the entirety of the system. And the best example that I know of, which is a sentence, different variations of that same sentence, is basically, what is your Sri Lankan, Ethiopian, or Filipino? And Sri Lankan in this question is not meant to denote the nationality coming from Sri Lanka, but actually a mate. Sri Lankan equals mate in this situation. And so this is a sentence that I've heard myself, with my own ears in, as I said, in different variations. I've heard Lebanese employers or prospective Lebanese employers basically debate among one another which nationality is better. So, I would hear things like, I actually don't remember the details, but Filipinos are good on this and that, but not on this. And Ethiopians are better at doing this, and Sri Lankans are, et cetera, et cetera. And even then you would have a racial hierarchy with Filipino women being seen as more proper, they speak English better maybe, or whatnot, with Ethiopian women being at the bottom, even though they are actually the majority of migrant domestic workers in Lebanon. And this brings me sort of to the third component, which is criminalization. And you have this sentence, which is, it kind of summarizes the entire thing, I feel, is that the configuration, and I'm quoting, sorry, and the configuration of the system thus invites the private Lebanese citizen to take the law into their own hands and carry out the surveying function of state security, end quote. So essentially, you explained very well, and through the multiple examples, and please feel free to give, a few examples that you know of, so that we don't just talk in the abstract, of how the code really summarizes how there is active participation or even passive participation by ordinary Lebanese citizens, whether employers or non-employers, just people who consider or who are meant to eventually, through this process of normalization and dehumanization, essentially see this type of labor as de facto inferior, as essentially a quote-unquote normal, like this is just a normal thing to happen. And yet when the occasions in which we see the underlying violence that really supports the system is when these migrant domestic workers try and do something else. So if they escape the household because it was abusive, or they were not being paid, or they were harassed, etc., they are automatically, of course, illegal aliens in Lebanon. So their de facto existence becomes criminalized. If they even want to seek another job, they cannot do so. Obviously, it's de facto banned in advance. So given, and here I'm quoting you again, given that racialization is an inherently relational process, this begs the question of how the dynamics of the system in turn affect the subjectivities of those subsumed under the category of the dominant race, as they assume this responsibility and authority of state sovereignty within the intimacy of the home and or workplace. And then you say, finally, I explore the manner in which racial categories emerge in the exercises of power, which summon the sovereign authority of the employer cum sponsor. So essentially, rather than the state having this quote unquote legitimate use of violence, it's the average citizen that ends up performing that, as you mentioned, like that, the surveying function of state security. Can you walk us through a bit that process as well?
Right, exactly. So one of the kind of odd things about the Kafala system is that it's sort of, by virtue of the sponsorship arrangement, it invites the private citizen to sort of take the law into their hands and perform this, traditionally state function of, monitoring or regulating the presence of foreign or non-citizens in the country, or foreign workers. Basically, it's, again, by giving this authority to private citizens, it's conditioning through these kind of structural processes the behavior of Lebanese. And I think one of the kind of most revealing anecdotes of this dynamic is the experience of a friend. So through my research, I interviewed a group of Asian and African residents of Beirut who are not migrant workers employed under the Kafala system. And so by kind of recording their experiences of racism, we see how, despite, being removed from the structural conditions that produce these categories of race, by virtue of their racial difference, are still subjected to the same processes. So there's the story of Where's Your Madam, where a woman who is a graduate student at AUB from Uganda, went to the grocery store, recently arrived in Lebanon, and was, putting things in the basket, buying a big, large collection of items. And, as she's walking through the supermarket, putting things in her basket, the store clerk comes up to her and, looks furious and grabs the basket out of her hand and, what are you doing? And, she was like, what do you mean? I'm shopping. And the next thing she says is, where's your madam? And so this is, a fully, free woman who's going and shopping. And because of her racial difference, she invites the kind of surveillance and suspicion of those around her by virtue of her being Black. And so when the Lebanese store clerk sees her, putting a bunch of things in a basket, not with anyone else, they think, oh, this is, a domestic worker that has run away, or like she's doing something. And so she's, by that signal of race, by seeing this Black woman performing this action that sort of defies the typical behavior of racialized women in Beirut, she's then, empowered to police her behavior and act kind of on behalf of the state to say, what are you doing? So this is how, this aspect of race is what sort of renders domestic workers who try and escape abusive situations vulnerable, is because they can't, walk out into the society and escape that like social assumption of who they are and where they're from. Another example, there's another graduate student from Kenya interviewed, and again, he's an AUB student, comes from a wealthy family, and not under the Kafala system. He has legal residency status, and he tried to go to a nice kind of upscale restaurant in Byblos and sits down at the tables with two other friends who are also Black. And before the service staff would even give them the menus, they force them to show their residency permits and their ability to pay. So these experiences of kind of racialized individuals who are not under the Kafala system, but still experience, very similar manifestations of racism, again, show how the Kafala system operates through this aspect of racial difference. So even when, the structural conditions are absent, the kind of ideological assumptions about race persist and kind of maintain the discipline of the.
Yeah, absolutely. And like this even extends to well, as you mentioned, Black people who are in Lebanon as you know, students, workers, whatnot, but not like under the kafala system. And it also extends to Lebanese of part African ancestry or Asian ancestry. So I will link this in the blog post associated with this episode. But there was a number of there's quite a lot of things that were done on that subject as well, including by Afro-Lebanese or Asian Lebanese, on how basically the same question of like, where is your madam, is something that they themselves heard even as they were growing up in Lebanon, speak Lebanese Arabic, obviously as Lebanese. And until that racialization separates their identity from the rest of Lebanon through this process of racialization and dehumanization, they may not even see themselves as necessarily different. It's something that's actually imposed on them. And so there's a number of stories on that dimension of it. And the final thing, or the final component, is the most gendered one, I suppose, is the sexualization one. And this, here I'll quote you again: the structure of the kafala system, which requires domestic workers to reside in the house of their employers, juridically confines the racialized female body within the boundaries of domestic work. Thus, as the migrant female body transgresses the boundaries of domestic work and ventures outside the home of the employer, she summarily triggers the process of criminalization, whereby the notions of illegality inscribed on the racialized female body summon understandings of racial difference coterminous with the implied sexual deviance and propensity for promiscuity, end quote. And we've seen this a number of times. We've seen it a few times when it was videotaped, and we've heard about it much more frequently, where you would just have like two random Ethiopian women walking down the streets in, let's say, Gemese or whatever, and they would be physically assaulted or sexually assaulted by just random Lebanese or non-Lebanese, whatever, passers-by, and no one really stops them, because this is seen as like their bodies are de facto dehumanized and criminalized through the processes that we've been talking about here. So can you talk a bit about this dimension, the sexualization? And I know that you referenced Maya Mikdash's work on sextarianism. If you can talk a bit about that, and I will, once you're done, I will expand a bit about why I also feel that sextarianism, looking at basically the intersection between sectarianism, patriarchy, sex, sect, family, and so on, why it's actually so important to look at the intersection between all of these dimensions in the Lebanese context.
Right, exactly. So yeah, I mean, there are a number of male migrant workers, but primarily the population of migrant workers or migrant domestic workers who are often confined to their employer's house. And so like in the instances of, where's your madam, where women outside the house are presumed to have escaped, or their actions outside of the confines of that domestic labor are criminalized. And oftentimes, women outside of the confines of domestic work are assumed, racialized women outside of the confines of domestic work are assumed to be sex workers. And so that racialized difference is kind of infused with this process of sexualization, where assumptions about the sexual deviancy or behavior of racialized women then invite the sexual harassment and egregious forms of abuse towards women who are racially distinct. This was an experience that was communicated to me by all of the different migrant domestic women, or all of the racialized women that I interviewed, and that like they can't go out onto the street by themselves without being harassed by Lebanese onlookers. And so it's kind of the combination of these racial and sexual connotations that are ascribed on the kind of migrant female body that then manifest in these egregious forms of abuse that we see. And we can find the juridical precedent for this process of sexualization in the policies and administrative decisions that are implemented by General Security, which is the body or the entity of the state that is responsible for regulating the kind of legality of migrant workers. And so it has since been repealed, but in the past they issued a what was known popularly as the love ban, which restricted migrant domestic workers from partaking in romantic relationships, while working here in Lebanon. And the employer was the one that was supposed to be responsible for enforcing this. And so by setting this kind of juridical precedent of confining the kind of existence of racialized women to their labor once they transgress that labor or they transgress those categories, then they are ascribed the sort of sexual deviancy that then produce these kind of social attitudes that manifest in these kind of violent forms of sexism and assault. And I was going to say something and then I forgot. What was the other question you asked? Sorry.
Yes, you were referencing Maya Mikdash's work on sectarianism and the intersection between essentially between sect and gender.
So yeah, and when you think about the aspect of citizenship, so primarily it's women who are coming in, and so because in Lebanon, Lebanese citizenship is inherited through the father, the prospect of a relationship between a Lebanese man and a, let's say, Ethiopian woman who comes to Lebanon to work would then produce a racialized Lebanese child, which would then have full Lebanese citizenship. And so in the same way that the state uses these modes of sexual difference to kind of police and maintain neat categories of sectarian difference, the same kind of dynamic applies to racial difference, where by restricting and policing the sexuality of migrant domestic workers, they can kind of maintain these neat racial categories and maintain kind of the whitened identity of Lebanese citizenship. So yeah, that's.
Yeah, absolutely. And so like Maya Mikdash's theorization, or like the term that she coined or she expanded upon, like sectarianism as this kind of intersection between sects and gender and sex is very important, because for the most part, and this is something that I've mentioned before in some other episodes, but there is even within activist circles in Lebanon, there is a tendency of separating the Kafala system from the wider fight against sectarianism, for example. Whereas what I think she does so well, and what your thesis does very well as well, is show that these two are actually very, very much tied, and that the components that we mentioned so far, like commodification, inferiorization, criminalization, and sexualization, these are all components of this oppressive structure, without which it could not function as well. Let's say it might function differently, but it wouldn't function as well as it does, as it's doing right now. And so to sort of wrap it up in a sense, I wanted to ask you in the introduction of your thesis, you asked this question, like, so attempting to theorize the system, the Kafala system, you ask institutionalized slavery, indentured servitude, or human trafficking. So if I would ask you to answer that question, how would you answer it?
My point in asking those questions was to draw attention, or to reframe the conversation about the Kafala system. And given that, it's the work that's done on the Kafala focuses primarily on kind of these human rights issues of human trafficking, indentured servitude, and slavery. And of course, the practices and dynamics of the system definitely resemble those practices. So those comparisons are, fitting. And, the practices that we observe under Kafala are definitely tantamount to slavery and human trafficking. But similar to the point that you mentioned earlier about how the critiques of the system often kind of individualizes the problems of abuse, like it's an issue of, Lebanese employers being bad, and that you just need to convince them to treat their workers with respect, rather than, Lebanese employers operating within this kind of larger system of power and structures of power that set up these processes and dynamics that, produce ideologies and behaviors about race that manifest in racism targeted at migrant workers. And so by drawing attention to the aspect of race, I'm trying to show that the Kafala system is sort of this kind of modern neoliberal capitalist institution that treats or renders migrant bodies as objects of trade and operates through this aspect of racial difference, so that these kind of very localized manifestations of racism that migrant workers are subjected to on a daily basis, while obviously being deriving from a very particular social context, also kind of insert themselves or derive from a much larger system of global hierarchies of development and racial hierarchies that stem from kind of the proliferation of neoliberal ideologies and the consolidation of global capitalism. So while the Kafala does carry elements of slavery and indentured servitude and human trafficking, I would say that it is not either any of those things, but a modern neoliberal capitalist institution.
Well, Daryn, you've been very, very generous with your time. On a sort of like in a concluding note, what are you hoping to continue to investigate, continuing to working in Lebanon on this, on the Kafala system, or maybe on related topics as well? For example, are you planning on publishing this thesis, and where can people find your work as well?
Yes, so definitely, I think given all the developments that have taken place, since I wrote this thesis with COVID and the economic crisis that have kind of rendered the vulnerability and exploitation that migrant workers face ever more visible, and have greatly exacerbated the vulnerability that they face. So I think now more than ever, it is like the timing is apt to call for and mobilize for the abolition of the Kafala system. So yes, I hope to continue working on my research and publishing it in some format. I'll give you the link to the Dropbox so that anyone can go and read it in its current form.
Amazing.
And yeah.
Awesome. I will definitely link that on the associated blog post on the website as well. Daryn, thank you a lot for your time. This has been really great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.